In the quiet mountain town of Pine Valley, a deaf baker carries a lethal secret behind his gentle smile and flour-dusted apron. When the notorious Shadow Wolves gang storms into his beloved bakery, they mock the silent man who can't hear their taunts. But what these hardened criminals don't realize is that Marcus Chen isn't just a humble pastry chef. He's the legendary Ghost Warrior, former Special Forces operative whose classified missions made him a whispered legend in military circles, who single-handedly rescued 23 hostages from an impossible situation in the mountains of Afghanistan. Now, after finding peace in the simple art of baking, he must decide whether to break his vow of leaving violence behind to protect his new community from these wolves in sheep's clothing. If this story of hidden strength speaks to you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's video will leave you questioning everything you believe about second chances. The pre-dawn light painted soft shadows across Marcus Chen's weathered face as he methodically kneaded dough on the worn wooden counter of Valley's Rise Bakery. His strong hands, which had once been instruments of precisely executed combat maneuvers, now moved with gentle purpose through the morning ritual that had become his salvation. The only sound he could feel was the rhythmic vibration of his knuckles, working the dough, a peaceful sensation that had helped heal the wounds left by the explosion that had taken his hearing 5 years ago. The sweet aroma of baking bread filled the air as Alisa Mitchell, the local schoolteacher, pushed open the bakery's front door, triggering the special light system Marcus had installed to alert him of customers. She carried her usual thermos of coffee, steam rising from its open top into the crisp mountain air. Her cheerful smile faltered slightly as she noticed the tension in Marcus's shoulders, a subtle shift in his usually serene demeanor that her years of friendship had taught her to recognize. Alisa set her thermos down and signed carefully, her movements precise from months of learning to communicate with the baker who had transformed their small mountain community through his dedication to bringing people together over freshly baked goods. "Something's troubling you, Marcus." The baker's hands stilled on the dough, flour dusting his forearms like mountain snow. He wiped his hands clean before signing back, his movements carrying the measured precision that Alisa had noticed emerged only when something truly disturbed his usual calm. "3 suspicious men passed through before dawn," he signed, his gestures controlled but intense. "Cased the street, checked sightlines, military training, not local." Alisa studied his face, noting how his eyes constantly scanned the windows. And door, a habit she'd noticed, surfaced only when his combat instincts were triggered. His deafness had somehow enhanced his other senses, making him extraordinarily attuned to vibrations and visual changes in his environment. "Should I tell Sheriff Cooper?" A ghost of a smile touched Marcus's lips as his hands moved in response. "Cooper's a good man with a brave heart, but he's never faced men like these." He turned to face her fully, and for a moment, something shifted. In his eyes, a hardness that seemed at odds with the gentle baker she'd known for the past 5 years. "Best get word to the families on Mountain View Street. Tell them to come into town today. Call it a special tasting event." Alisa had known Marcus Chen for 5 years, watched him build this bakery with his own hands, seen him teach local kids the art of bread making, comfort grieving widows with warm pastries, and bring the community together through the simple magic of shared meals. She'd never questioned his past, never wondered why a deaf baker sometimes watched the street with the eyes of a predator. But now, something in his manner made her shiver despite the warm morning air. "Who are they, Marcus?" she signed, her movements small and tight with concern. "The Shadow Wolves," he replied, his signs sharp and decisive. "They've been moving through mountain towns like ours, targeting peaceful communities they think can't fight back. They've left a trail of broken businesses and shattered lives across 3 states." The name meant nothing to Alisa, but the way Marcus signed it told her everything she needed to know. She gathered her purse, ready to spread the warning, but paused at his next signs. "When they come," he signed, still focused on arranging his. "Morning pastries with deliberate care. People will see things that might make them question their faith in me as their baker, their friend." His movements carried a weight she'd never seen before. "All I ask is that you remember everything I've done here. Every loaf of bread, every moment of kindness, every community gathering. It's all been real. The only lies have been about who I was, not who I am." Alisa wanted to question him further, but the subtle vibration of approaching motorcycles drew their attention. Through the large bakery windows, they could see dust rising from the mountain road. Marcus's expression remained calm, but his hands had stopped their work entirely. "Go now," he signed softly. "Warn the others. I'll greet our visitors." The way his hands formed the last word carried echoes of something dangerous, something that made Alisa hurry toward the bakery's back door. As she left, she glanced back to see Marcus removing his apron with slow, deliberate movements. For the first time in 5 years, she wondered if she'd ever really known the man who had brought such warmth and community to their small mountain town. Outside, the dust clouds grew larger as more motorcycles approached. The morning sun caught something metal around Marcus's neck, not his usual plain chain, but a set of worn dog tags he normally kept hidden. His fingers touched them briefly as he observed the approaching threat, and for a moment, Alisa could have sworn she saw tears. In his eyes, the rumble of motorcycles grew stronger, their vibrations now clear even to Alisa. Marcus stood at his counter, his stance shifting subtly into something more balanced, more ready. Whatever was coming, whatever secrets he carried, Alisa realized he had already made his peace with what must be done. She slipped away through the back door, carrying his warning to the town, as the first shadows of the shadow wolves fell across the bakery's front steps. If this tale of a warrior turned baker has captured your attention, hit that subscribe button. The quiet strength of Pine Valley is about to be tested in ways that will leave you questioning everything you know about courage and redemption. The Shadow Wolves' arrival brought a silence to Pine Valley that reminded Marcus of the calm before an ambush. Their motorcycles' vibrations pulsed through the wooden floorboards, a sensation that triggered memories he'd spent 5 years trying to forget. 8 riders dismounted outside the bakery, their black leather jackets adorned with snarling wolf patches that had become notorious across 3 states. Their leader, a man whose face bore a distinctive titanium plate above his left eye, surveyed the bakery with obvious contempt. "Well, boys," the leader's voice carried the kind of mockery that had preceded violence in every town they'd visited, though Marcus could only read his lips through the large front windows. "Looks like we found ourselves another soft target." The morning sun glinted off his metal implant, a war trophy he'd earned in a less legal conflict. Marcus stood behind his counter, one hand resting on the smooth wooden surface, the other holding a fresh loaf of sourdough. The morning light caught his silver-streaked hair, a stark contrast to the hardened faces of the men now entering his shop. The special light system he'd installed flashed repeatedly as each man crossed the threshold, their heavy boots sending vibrations through the floorboards that Marcus could feel with perfect clarity. "Welcome to Valley's Rise Bakery," Marcus spoke, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he'd developed over years of learning to speak without being able to hear himself. "Everything's fresh baked this morning." His eyes met the leader's, showing neither fear nor judgment, though he registered every subtle movement, every shift in stance that telegraphed potential violence. The scarred leader's laugh held no humor as he read the name tag on Marcus's flour-dusted apron. His lips moved deliberately, mocking, "Look here, boys, we got ourselves a friendly deaf baker." He mounted the steps to the counter slowly, boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Tell me, Marcus, Did you lose your hearing baking too many cookies? Through the vibrations in the floor, Marcus felt one of the younger riders moving toward the display case of pastries, his stance betraying nervous energy. The boy, barely more than 20, fidgeted with his jacket zipper. "Boss, something ain't right about this one. The way he stands." The leader silenced him with a glare before turning back to Marcus. "Name's Drake. Drake Steele. Figured you should know who's going to be your new business partner." He leaned forward, using his height, advantage to loom over the counter. "We'll be staying in your town for a while, doing some local business development." His smile revealed expensive dental work as he continued, "Unless you've got some objection." Marcus's response was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Cooper, his boots sending new vibrations across the floor as he hurried into the bakery. The young lawman's hand rested nervously on his holstered weapon, his badge catching the morning light. "Everything okay here, Marcus?" Cooper called out, his lips easy to read despite his obvious tension. The shadow wolves turned to face him, their casual postures carrying deadly promise. Marcus raised his hands in a calming gesture, speaking clearly, "Just discussing business with some new customers, Sheriff. Though perhaps we should continue this conversation in the back." His eyes met Steele's challenging stare, "where we can sample some fresh bread in privacy." Steele studied the baker for a long moment, something like recognition flickering across his metal-adorned features. "You know, there's something familiar about you, Baker. Remind me of someone I heard about once. A ghost story from back in my military days." Marcus's expression remained unchanged, but those watching closely might have noticed his right hand slip beneath the counter, touching something hidden there. "I'm just a simple baker," he spoke carefully, making sure Steele could read his lips. "Though I'd be happy to share some real ghost stories over coffee and pastries." The tension was broken by the sound of more motorcycles, their vibrations distinct even through the thick floorboards. Steele's smile widened as he recognized the approaching rumble. "Ah, perfect timing. The rest of our associates have arrived." He turned back to Marcus, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that Marcus could read all too clearly. "Hope your kitchen has plenty of room, Baker. We've got some serious business to discuss." Sheriff Cooper backed away slowly, understanding he was outmatched, but unwilling to leave Marcus alone. "Go check on the school, Sheriff," Marcus called out, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "Make sure Miss Mitchell has everything she needs for today's lessons." The hidden meaning wasn't lost on Cooper. Protect the children. Warn the parents. Steele watched the exchange with growing interest, his metal plate catching the morning light. "Awful authoritative for a deaf baker," he observed, eyes narrowing. "Sure you haven't led men before? Maybe in some other line of work?" Marcus's response was to reach beneath the counter and bring out a fresh cinnamon roll, his movements deliberate and controlled. "In my experience," he spoke clearly, ensuring Steele could read every word, "breaking bread together is the best way to start any negotiation." The offering brought another laugh from Steele, but this one held an edge of uncertainty. Something about the baker's calm in the face of their intimidation had begun to unsettle him, though he couldn't say exactly why. "We'll see who's breaking." "What, soon enough," Steele declared, descending the steps to rejoin his men. "Keep your ovens hot, Baker. By the time we're done here, this town's going to need more than just comfort food." As the shadow wolves moved toward the door, Marcus watched them go, his hand unconsciously touching the dog tags beneath his shirt. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains, promising a storm. But the baker's thoughts were on another. A kind of tempest, one that had been building for 5 years, ever since he'd buried his combat gear and taken up the peaceful art of baking. If you're finding yourself drawn into this tale of hidden identities and approaching storms, take a moment to subscribe. The confrontation building in Pine Valley will shake your faith in what you think you know about peace and protection. Evening shadows crept across Pine Valley as Marcus Chen sat alone in his small office behind the bakery. The room's only illumination came from a single desk lamp, its light catching the worn dog tags that now lay on his desk rather than around his neck. Beside them sat a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, addressed simply, "To be opened when they find you." The vibrations of the Shadow Wolves' revelry carried from the tavern across the street. Breaking glass, heavy footsteps, and the occasional rumble of motorcycles fired in celebration of nothing in particular. Each tremor made Marcus's hands twitch slightly, muscle memory responding to a rhythm they hadn't forgotten in 5 years. A gentle knock at his door preceded Alisa's entrance. Her special pattern of taps a code they'd developed over the years. She carried a fresh pot of coffee and concern in her eyes. Setting the pot down carefully, she signed, "They're getting worse. 3 families have already fled up the mountain. Sheriff Cooper tried to stop them, but..." She trailed off, watching Marcus's expression in the lamplight. "But he's out of his depth," Marcus finished, speaking and signing simultaneously, his voice carrying no judgment. "Cooper's a good man, Alisa. He's just never seen true evil." His fingers traced the edge of the sealed envelope. "I have." Alisa's eyes were drawn to the dog tags, gleaming dully in the lamp's glow. In 5 years, she'd never seen him remove them. "Marcus," she signed softly, using his name sign, a combination of strength and bread that the community had given him. "What's in the letter?" The baker was quiet for a long moment, the lamplight casting deep shadows across his Asian features. "Mission details," he finally answered, his signs precise and measured. Names, locations, classified operations that were never officially acknowledged. Everything I did before I lost my hearing. His hand moved unconsciously to his right ear. "Everything I did before an IED changed my life's path." Another crash echoed from the tavern, followed by cruel laughter. This time Marcus didn't flinch, his expression growing more resolute. "They're not just here by chance," he continued. "Steele recognized something in me, even if he can't place it yet. The Shadow Wolves, they're hunting ghosts. My ghosts." Alisa sank into the room's other chair, her mind racing. "The Ghost Warrior," she signed hesitantly, the name coming from half-remembered news reports and whispered rumors. "They say he led an impossible rescue mission in the Hindu Kush. 23 hostages, extracted without a single casualty." 23 civilians, Marcus corrected quietly, speaking aloud while signing. "And it wasn't single-handed. I had a team, good men." His eyes met hers, carrying both shame and certainty. "I've saved more lives than I can count, Alisa. Each Sunday I host community breakfasts, serving muffins and coffee while carrying the weight of classified operations that changed the course of wars." The sound of approaching boots interrupted their conversation. Heavy steps on the bakery's wooden floor. Multiple men moving with deliberate menace. Marcus touched the letter briefly before sliding it into his desk drawer. "Alisa," he said and signed, his movements taking on an urgency she'd never seen before. "Whatever happens next, remember that my silence wasn't just about my deafness. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought quietly, without anyone knowing." "They've been won." The office door burst open, revealing Drake Steele and 3 of his men. Their leader's titanium plate caught the lamp's glow as he took in the scene, his scarred face splitting in a predatory grin. "Hope we're not interrupting story time," he sneered, making sure Marcus could see his lips. His eyes fixed on the dog, tags still lying on the desk. "Evening services are tomorrow at dawn," Marcus replied calmly, not rising from his chair, though Alisa noticed his posture had shifted subtly into something more balanced, more ready. "Though you're welcome to confess your sins now if they're weighing on your conscience." Steele's hand shot out, faster than a man his size should move, snatching up the dog tags. "Mighty peculiar thing for a baker to keep," he said, turning them in the lamplight. "Especially one with such interesting ideas about confession." His eyes narrowed as he studied the tag's worn surface. You know what these remind me of? Story I heard about a special forces operator, one they called the Ghost Warrior. Man who could move through enemy territory like a shadow, appear and disappear without a trace. He leaned closer, his metal plate gleaming. Of course, he vanished 5 years ago. Same time, a massive explosion took out half a mountainside in Afghanistan. Alisa felt her breath catch as Steele's words confirmed what she'd begun to suspect. Marcus remained seated, his expression unchanged, but something had shifted in his posture, a subtle readiness that hadn't been there moments before. Interesting. Theory, the baker said softly, ensuring his words were clear. Though I seem to recall that mission was classified. The men involved never broke operational security. Classified, Steele spat, his hand dropping to his jacket pocket. Nothing's classified to men who were there, unless you're willing to explain how you know about operational security, Baker. His scarred face twisted in a mockery of thoughtfulness. Or should I say, Sergeant? Marcus's eyes moved to Alisa, then back to Steele. The vibrations of more motorcycles arriving pulsed through the floorboards, their rhythm carrying deadly promise. The past stays buried, he spoke carefully, each word precise. Sometimes that's the only way forward. Steele studied him for a long moment, then pocketed the dog tags. You know what I think, Baker? I think tomorrow's breakfast service might need some special additions. Maybe a few war stories. He backed toward the door, his men following his lead. Sleep tight, and remember, his scarred face twisted in a cruel smile. Ghosts can't stay hidden forever. After they left, Alisa released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Marcus, she signed, her hands trembling slightly. What are you going to do? The baker rose slowly, his movements carrying the fluid grace of a man who had never truly forgotten his combat training. Through the window, they could see the shadow wolves retreating to the tavern, their shadows dancing in the evening light like demons at a revival. What I should have done when they first arrived, he answered, his signs carrying the weight of years of violence and peace. Prepare, because after tomorrow, they're going to learn why they called me the Ghost. If you've been drawn into this tale of hidden pasts and approaching judgment, make sure to subscribe. The storm gathering over Pine Valley is about to break, and you won't want to miss what happens when a warrior's past meets a baker's present. Dawn painted the bakery windows blood red as Marcus Chen worked methodically at his counter. His morning bread-making ritual interrupted by the vibrations of breaking glass from across the street. The Shadow Wolves had spent the night turning the tavern into their personal kingdom, their revelry growing darker with each passing hour. Now, in the harsh light of morning, their true nature was beginning to show. Sheriff Cooper burst through the bakery doors, triggering Marcus's light system. The young lawman's face was lined with worry as he mouthed the words urgently, knowing Marcus would read them. They're demanding protection money from every business in town. Old man Henderson from the hardware store tried to refuse. He swallowed. Odd. They broke both his hands. Marcus's expression remained serene, but his fingers tightened on the rolling pin as he carefully set it down. The familiar weight of the dog tags was missing from his neck, taken by Steele as a trophy, but their absence somehow made him feel lighter, more ready. The world tests us in many ways, Sheriff, he spoke clearly, ensuring Cooper could understand him. Sometimes through the actions of others, sometimes through our own fears. He moved toward the bakery's rear door with surprising grace. Walk with me. Behind the bakery stood a small herb garden, its neat rows of rosemary and thyme, a testament to Marcus's dedication to his craft. He led Cooper to a freshly turned section of earth near the fence. Young Tommy Parker, the baker explained, his voice steady. We planted these seeds together last week. He was so proud to help, asked if they'd grow as tall as the mountains. He studied the dark soil thoughtfully. In his last baking lesson, he asked if I'd teach him to make his grandmother's favorite cookies when she gets better. Cooper shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his badge seeming heavier by the moment. With all due respect, Marcus, we're not talking about garden bullies. These men are killers. The vibrations of more motorcycle engines punctuated his words. Yes, Marcus agreed softly, his eyes distant. They are. Something in his tone made Cooper look at him sharply. Tell me, Sheriff, what do you know about Operation Mountain Ghost? The young lawman frowned at the apparent change of subject. That was before my time. Some classified mission in Afghanistan that went wrong. They say a whole team went in after hostages, but only one man came out with all 23 civilians. He paused, realization dawning on his face. They called him the Ghost Warrior. Marcus finished, his hand unconsciously touching his right ear where the explosion had taken his hearing. The official reports never mentioned the cost of such things, the price of becoming a ghost. A commotion from the street drew their attention. Through the garden fence, they could see Steele and his men had cornered Alisa outside the school, their intentions clear in their leering faces and aggressive postures. Marcus's expression hardened as he watched Steele waving the stolen dog tags, taunting the teacher. Time for a choice, Sheriff, the baker said quietly. You can keep trying to maintain order against men who respect no law but violence. He reached down and touched one of Tommy's newly planted seeds. Or you can trust that sometimes the quietest warriors are the most effective. Cooper studied Marcus's face, noting how the morning light caught the silver in his hair, the subtle scars that had always been there but somehow seemed more prominent now. Even if that was true, he said carefully, even if you really were him, you're not that man anymore. You're a baker, a man of peace. Marcus's smile carried no warmth. Peace is not the absence of conflict, Sheriff. Sometimes it's the willingness to stand against evil, no matter the cost. He turned toward the bakery. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for this morning's special delivery. Something tells me it's going to be well attended. As Cooper hurried to deal with the situation at the school, Marcus made his way to the bakery's basement. There, beneath years of flour dust and forgotten recipe books, stood an old footlocker secured with a biometric lock that would match his fingerprint. The baker ran his fingers across its surface, remembering another life, another name. Alisa's scream cut through his thoughts, the vibration of her distress clear even through the basement walls. Through the small ground-level window, he could see Steele dragging her toward the tavern, her attempts to resist earning only cruel laughter from his men. "Lord," Marcus whispered, his hand resting on the footlocker's lid. "I know I promised to forsake violence when you spared my life in that mountain pass. But sometimes," his voice caught as another vibration of distress shook the floorboards, "sometimes the baker must protect his community from those who would poison it." The footlocker's lock responded to his touch, its mechanism sliding open with well-maintained precision to reveal not the weapons Steele might have expected, but something far more deadly. Specialized tactical gear that had once made him a legend in the mountains of Afghanistan. The matte black equipment lay exactly as he had packed it 5 years ago, a testament to skills that had never truly been forgotten. "The best weapons," Marcus murmured, lifting the first piece of gear, "are the ones your enemy never sees coming." Through the basement window, he could feel the vibrations of Pine Valley awakening to fear, its peaceful rhythms disrupted by men who understood only the language of violence. "Sometimes through bread," he said softly, remembering all the lives he'd touched with his baking, sometimes through shadows. If you've been following this tale of redemption and responsibility, take a moment to subscribe. The moment of truth approaching in Pine Valley will challenge everything you believe about the price of peace and the nature of true strength. The saloon's batwing doors crashed open as Drake Steele shoved Alisa Mitchell inside, his titanium plate catching the morning light. The schoolteacher stumbled, but kept her feet, her eyes scanning the room filled with shadow wolves. The morning sun, streaming through dirty windows, caught the dog tags hanging from Steele's neck, the same tags that had witnessed countless classified missions now being used as a trophy of intimidation. Behind him, the rest of his men filed in, their boots leaving muddy tracks on the wooden floor. The tavern had changed overnight, transformed from a simple gathering place into something darker. Broken bottles littered the floor, cards from interrupted games scattered across tables still stained with spilled whiskey. The mirror behind the bar bore a spiderweb of cracks, and the bartender, old Jack Wilson, lay unconscious in the corner, his face bruised from refusing to serve another round. "Looks like we finally found some proper entertainment, boys," Steele announced, spreading his arms wide. "Though first, maybe we should have story time. Ain't that right, teacher?" His mocking laugh was cut short by a sound that made every man in the room freeze, the measured tap of boots on wooden steps, accompanied by something else, a rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Even the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams seemed to still. Several of the younger riders instinctively reached for their weapons, then froze as the tapping grew closer. Through the windows, townsfolk could be seen hurrying away from the tavern, as if they sensed what was coming. Marcus Chen stood in the tavern entrance, but he wasn't wearing his familiar flour-dusted apron. Instead, he was dressed in close-fitting tactical gear, the kind designed for silent movement and deadly efficiency. His silver-streaked hair caught the morning light, and his usual gentle expression had been replaced by something harder, something that belonged to another time and another place. "Let her go, Drake," Marcus spoke, his voice carrying the same measured clarity he used while teaching baking classes, though now it held an edge sharp as a combat knife. "The community's kindness has limits. Even divine patience runs out eventually." Steele's hand dropped to his jacket, but he made no move to draw, his eyes darting around the room, assessing angles, distances, potential cover. The tactical analysis of a man who had seen real combat. "Well, well," he sneered, making sure Marcus could read his lips. "The deaf baker finally shows some teeth." His eyes fixed on Marcus's tactical gear, "though you seem to be a bit overdressed for making muffins." Alisa watched the exchange with growing understanding. She had known Marcus Chen for years, seen him create beautiful pastries, teach children the joy of baking, guide lost souls to find community around his tables. But this was different. The way he held himself, the subtle shift in his stance. She was seeing layers of the man peel away, revealing something that had been hidden beneath apron and flour dust. "The gear," Marcus's smile held no warmth, "is exactly where it needs to be." As if in response, the lights in the tavern flickered, then went out completely. In the sudden darkness, even Steele's men who had been watching the entrance lost sight of the baker. When the lights came back on 3 seconds later, Marcus was standing in a completely different position, having moved without making a vibration that even Alisa could feel. "Amazing what proper preparation can accomplish," Marcus continued, his voice coming from behind some of Steele's men, causing them to whirl in surprise. The younger riders looked up nervously, but the older ones kept their eyes moving, searching for their opponent. They had heard the stories whispered in forward operating bases and around campfires. Stories about a warrior who could move like a ghost, who had extracted hostages from under the noses of an entire terrorist cell without a single shot being fired. Something like uncertainty flickered across Steele's metal-adorned features. 1 man against 12, those ain't odds even the ghost warrior would take. His voice carried bravado, but his eyes told a different story. The legend of the Ghost Warrior had grown over 5 years, and standing before its source was different from mocking it over drinks. "You're right," Marcus agreed, his voice now somehow seeming to come from multiple directions at once. a technique he'd perfected in the mountains of Afghanistan. But then, the ghost never needed more than himself. His hands moved with impossible speed, reaching up to the ceiling and killing the lights again. This time when they came back on, two of Steele's men were already unconscious, having been disabled without making a sound. "That's impossible," Steele snarled, his grip tightening on Alisa's arm. "No one's that fast, not anymore, not after what happened in the mountains." The vein in his temple pulsed visibly below his titanium plate. "No," Marcus corrected gently, his voice now directly behind Steele, though no one had seen or felt him. "Move. The ghost warrior didn't die in those mountains. He just found a different way to serve." His presence seemed to fill the room, making even the dust motes dance to his rhythm. "The explosion that took my hearing gave me something in return, a connection to vibration, to movement, to the very pulse of combat that most soldiers never develop." Through the morning air came the sound of approaching sirens as Sheriff Cooper's reinforcements finally arrived. Steele's men shifted nervously, their confidence wavering as they realized the trap they'd walked into. Their leader's face darkened with rage, a vein pulsing in his temple below the titanium plate. "You think this changes anything?" Steele snarled. "You're still just a crippled baker playing at being something he's not. The ghost warrior died 5 years ago in those mountains." "No," Marcus corrected softly. "He took a different path, found a different way to protect. But some skills," his voice hardened, "never forget their true purpose. If this tale of judgment and protection has captured your attention, take a moment to subscribe. The legend of the ghost warrior is about to become more than just a story whispered in shadows." Time seemed to slow in the dusty tavern as 12 men faced the reality of their situation. The morning sun painted stark shadows across worn floorboards, each crack and stain telling its own story of violence. Outside, sirens wailed closer, but everyone in the room knew the real conflict would be decided before they arrived. Steele's hand trembled slightly on Alisa's arm, his scarred face twisted in a combination of fear and fury. The dog tags around his neck caught the light, a reminder of how thoroughly they'd been deceived. Around him, his men struggled with a terrible realization. They weren't the predators anymore. They were the prey. "Tell me something, Baker," Steele said, his voice carrying forced bravado while ensuring his lips were clearly visible. "That mission in the Hindu Kush, was it really just one man against an entire compound? He was playing for time, trying to steady his nerves, but genuine curiosity tinged his words." Marcus moved like liquid shadow, appearing in different spots between his responses, each position perfectly calculated to maintain control of the room. "No," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "Everyone forgets about the 23 hostages. They weren't just cargo to be extracted. They became part of the mission." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, "just like how Alisa isn't just your hostage right now." The words struck home. Steele's face flushed with the realization that he'd been so focused on Marcus that he'd forgotten about his captive's capabilities. Alisa, who had spent 5 years learning from Marcus more than just sign language, drove her elbow up and back with precise force, breaking Steele's grip with a technique practiced countless times in the bakeries. "Back room." 2 of the younger riders made a break for the door. They didn't make it 3 steps before Marcus seemed to materialize between them, his movements a blur of efficient combat techniques. No brutal strikes, no deadly force, just precise pressure. Points and joint locks that left them gasping on the floor, disabled but unharmed. "Nobody leaves," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the authority of both Baker and Warrior. "Not until we finish this." His eyes scanned the room, noting every tensed muscle, every subtle shift of weight that telegraphed potential violence. "The Lord gives us choices, gentlemen. Even now there's a path to redemption. Surrender to the law, face justice with honor." One of the older riders, a weathered man with a faded Marine Corps tattoo on his neck, spoke up. And the other choice? His voice came out like a prayer, filled with equal parts fear and respect. Ghost warrior. The other choice. Marcus's expression hardened as he seemed to fade into shadow before reappearing across the room. Is to learn why they never found bodies after that mountain mission. Each word carried weight, dripping with lethal promise. Look around you. Notice anything about this tavern? The exposed support beams, the placement of the tables, the angle of the morning sun through those windows. Understanding dawned on the faces of the more experienced fighters. They weren't just trapped in a bar, they were standing in a carefully crafted combat zone. Even the broken bottles on the floor had been staged to limit movement, to channel targets into predictable paths. Alisa watched the revelation spread through the room. She had known Marcus Chen as a man of peace, had seen him spend countless hours teaching children to bake and bringing the community together. But this was different. This was a master tactician, revealing the deadly art that had made him legendary. Steel, desperate to regain control, yanked the dog tags from his neck and threw them at Marcus. "Fine words from a man who claims to have found peace," he snarled. "But I'm thinking all that talk of redemption was just that. Talk. Once a ghost, always a ghost. Ain't that right, Sergeant?" "You're wrong, Drake." Marcus's voice softened, carrying genuine sadness. "Redemption is real. I've lived it every day for 5 years. Taught children to bake, helped build this community, guided lost souls to find connection around my tables." His stance remained ready, but his words carried sincerity. And redemption isn't the same as weakness. Sometimes the most righteous path requires the hardest choices. Thunder crashed closer now, and the first drops of rain began to strike the tavern's roof. The sound created an otherworldly rhythm, like heaven itself was providing percussion for the drama unfolding below. Through the windows, townsfolk could be seen gathering at a safe distance, drawn by the tension crackling in the air. "Last chance," Marcus announced, his voice carrying over the growing storm. "The good book tells us that all things work together for good for those who seek redemption. But it also speaks of justice, of moments when peace must be backed by strength." His eyes met each rider in turn, offering one final opportunity for surrender. "What's it going to be, gentlemen? Dignity or defeat?" Steele's response was a desperate gamble. He lunged for Alisa again, hoping to use her as a shield while drawing his weapon. The movement was fast, born of years of violence and survival, but he had made a critical mistake. He had assumed the Ghost Warrior's legend was exaggerated. He was about to learn otherwise. If you've been drawn into this tale of justice and redemption, take a moment to subscribe. What happens next in Pine Valley will become the stuff of legend. They say time slows in moments of extreme danger, that a man can count the beats of his own heart between one breath and the next. As Steele lunged for Alisa, the world seemed to crystallize into perfect clarity. The schoolteacher dropped and rolled, years of Marcus's quiet lessons having prepared her for exactly this moment. Steele's hand reached out, grasping empty air where she had been, his titanium plate catching the morning light. The shadow wolves tensed, hands moving toward weapons, but everyone in the tavern knew the real action would unfold between two men. A scarred gang leader and a baker with a past written in classified files. The Ghost Warrior's legend had grown from moments exactly like this. "Lord have mercy," someone whispered, though whether prayer or curse was unclear. Marcus's movements were liquid grace, his tactical gear allowing silent, efficient motion that seemed to defy the laws of physics. In the 5 years since the mountain explosion, he hadn't lost his edge. He'd sharpened it differently. Alisa hit the floor and rolled behind the bar, demonstrating the defensive maneuvers Marcus had patiently taught her during countless early morning sessions before the bakery opened. The action saved her life as Steele's wild grab passed through. Empty space, The gang leader's momentum carried him forward, exactly as Marcus had anticipated. What happened next became the stuff of whispered legend in Pine Valley. Marcus seemed to fade into shadow before reappearing behind Steele, his movements completely silent, without even a vibration in the floorboards to betray his position. His first strike was precise, a nerve cluster that made Steele's right arm go numb, his weapon clattering to the floor. "Impossible!" Steele gasped, his face contorting as he spun to face his opponent. "No one moves like that, not even in the mountains." His words cut off as Marcus seemed to vanish again, reappearing on his opposite side. Two more shadow wolves moved to help their leader. Marcus flowed between them like smoke, his hands striking pressure points with surgical precision. Both men dropped, their legs temporarily paralyzed by expertly targeted nerve strikes. No permanent damage, just like the hostage extraction 5 years ago. The Ghost Warrior's signature was efficiency without unnecessary harm. That's why they never found bodies in the mountains. The ex-Marine with the neck tattoo breathed, understanding dawning in his eyes. He doesn't need to kill to win. Through the tavern windows, flashes of lightning illuminated the faces of townsfolk watching from safe distances, their expressions a mixture of fear and awe. Thunder crashed outside, perfectly timed with Marcus's movements, as if nature itself was providing sound effects for the deadly ballet unfolding within. All those morning baking sessions, Alisa realized aloud from her position behind the bar. The way you taught us to move through the kitchen, to handle hot pans and sharp knives. She watched as Marcus disabled another rider with a precisely targeted strike. You were teaching us more than just baking. Every skill serves two purposes. Marcus spoke clearly, ensuring his words could be read by all as he continued to move like shadow through the room. The same hands that can knead dough can disable an opponent. The same precision that crafts delicate pastries can target pressure points. He appeared behind two more riders, his strikes leaving them gasping but conscious. The same patience that helps bread rise can wait for the perfect moment to strike. Steele, his right arm still useless, backed toward the bar. His face showed the dawning horror of a man realizing he had gravely underestimated his opponent. "In the mountains," he snarled. "They said you were like a ghost, but this isn't human." "No," Marcus corrected, his voice gentle despite the violence of his movements. "This is what happens when you spend 5 years honing skills for protection instead of destruction." He seemed to fade into darkness before reappearing across the room. The explosion didn't just take my hearing. It gave me something else, a sensitivity to vibration that makes me more aware of movement than sight or sound ever could. The remaining Shadow Wolves watched in stunned silence as their leader faced off against the legend they'd unwittingly challenged. Marcus's movements were poetry in violence, each step calculated, each position perfect. He had turned the entire tavern into a weapon, using the staged environment to control and contain rather than destroy. "In the Hindu Kush," Marcus continued, his voice carrying over the storm outside, "I learned that the most effective warrior isn't the one who causes the most damage." He moved like liquid shadow around Steele, who swung desperately at empty air. "It's the one who achieves his objective with the least harm." Lightning flashed again, and in that stark illumination, the tableau in the tavern seemed frozen in time. Disabled riders clutching numbed limbs, Alisa watching from behind the bar, and a baker demonstrating that legends sometimes fall short of reality. Steele, his face a mask of desperation, grabbed a broken bottle with his left hand, but even this had been anticipated. Marcus's final movement was almost too fast to follow. One moment he was across the room, the next he was behind Steele, his hands finding precise pressure points that left the gang leader gasping on his knees, the bottle rolling harmlessly across. The flaw, the real power of the ghost, Marcus said softly, ensuring Steele could read his lips, was never in how many he could defeat. It was in how many he could save. If this demonstration of controlled strength has touched your soul, take a moment to subscribe. The aftermath of Heaven's thunder in Pine Valley will challenge everything you believe about true power. The storm outside began to ease, but inside the tavern, the air remained charged with something more potent than lightning. Dr. Emily Chang worked her way through the room, examining the disabled shadow wolves with professional detachment. Her weathered face betrayed no judgment as she moved from one immobilized rider to another, checking Marcus's precise pressure point work. Sheriff Cooper and his deputies collected weapons from the floor while maintaining careful watch on their subdued captives. Marcus Chen stood by the bar, now back in his familiar baker's apron, though his tactical gear remained visible beneath it. The morning light caught his silver-streaked hair as Alisa approached, carrying his recovered dog tags. 15 men, Cooper said quietly, approaching Marcus, all disabled without permanent injury. No broken bones, no lasting damage. He shook his head in wonder. That's not just skill, Marcus. That's something else entirely. Marcus's response was interrupted by a bitter laugh from Steele, who sat propped against the bar while Dr. Chang examined his numbed arm. Something else is right, the gang leader spat. 5 years playing at being a simple baker, but all that time you were just keeping your skills sharp, waiting for a chance to prove you were still the ghost. You're wrong, Drake. Marcus spoke clearly, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he used while teaching his baking classes. Every morning for 5 years, I practiced one thing, how to protect without destroying. The ghost warrior knew 1,000 ways to kill. The baker learned just one way to save. Alisa, who had been helping Dr. Chang with her rounds, paused to study Marcus's face. The equipment in your basement, she signed, her movements quick with realization. It wasn't just hiding your past, was it? It was marking the difference between then and now. Marcus nodded, his eyes distant with memory. Carlos Martinez died in my arms in those mountains, the last of the hostage takers to fall. But before he died, he said something that changed everything. His hand touched his right ear, where the explosion had forever silenced the world for him. He said being the fastest, the most lethal, only matters if you're running towards something, not just away from your past. Outside, the storm had passed completely, leaving behind the fresh-washed clarity that follows rain. Townsfolk began to gather closer to the tavern windows, drawn by the scene unfolding within. Through the doors, they could see their quiet baker standing among the aftermath of combat, yet somehow unsullied by it. The ex-Marine with the neck tattoo spoke up from his position against the wall, sensation slowly returning to his legs. I was there, you know, in the Hindu Kush with the hostage takers. All eyes turned to him as he continued. Got separated from my unit, fell in with bad people. Watched the whole rescue mission from inside the compound. He met Marcus's gaze. Never understood why you didn't take me out too when you found me after, because you were unarmed and asking for help, Marcus replied simply. Even then, I knew there had to be a better way than endless violence. I just hadn't found it yet. He turned to Steele, who had gone pale from shock, but whose eyes still burned with confusion and anger. The dog tags you stole weren't meant as a trophy, Drake. They were a reminder. A reminder of what? Steele demanded, his voice weak but defiant. The titanium plate in his head caught the morning light as he struggled to understand. Marcus crossed to where his dog tags lay on the bar, lifting them with the same care he used to handle his most delicate pastries. A reminder that every warrior has two purposes: to defeat enemies and to protect innocence. The choices we make, the paths we choose, they're all about which purpose we serve. Alisa moved to stand beside him, understanding dawning in her eyes. The special training sessions in the bakery, the way you taught us to move, to be aware of our surroundings. It was never just about baking, was it? It was about teaching us to protect ourselves and each other. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a final echo of the storm that had washed Pine Valley clean. Dr. Chang finished her rounds, reporting no serious injuries despite the number of disabled men. Sheriff Cooper began organizing his deputies to transport the prisoners, while townsfolk slowly filtered into the tavern, drawn by the scene of their baker standing victorious yet unchanged among the signs of controlled combat. "Your arm will recover fully in a few hours," Marcus told Steele, his voice gentle despite everything that had transpired. "The nerve clusters I targeted are temporarily disabled, not permanently damaged. Everyone here will heal." His eyes swept the room, taking in the subdued shadow wolves. "The question is, what will you learn from this healing?" Steele's response was cut short by the arrival of state police vehicles, their sirens echoing off the mountains. Through the tavern windows, more law enforcement could be seen approaching, drawn by reports of the confrontation. Marcus stood calmly. At his position by the bar, his posture relaxed but ready, a living bridge between the warrior he had been and the baker he had become. If this tale of transformation's price has touched your heart, take a moment to subscribe. The truth emerging in Pine Valley will challenge everything you thought you knew about strength and peace. Evening painted the bakery windows in amber and gold as Marcus Chen tended to his ovens, drawing out the last loaves of a day that had changed. Pine Valley forever. The day's events had left marks throughout the town. Subdued riders in holding cells, shocked whispers among the townspeople, and questions that hung in the air like the lingering scent of fresh bread. The bakery doors opened softly, admitting Sheriff Cooper and Alisa Mitchell. They found the baker kneeling by his ovens, his tactical gear now replaced by his familiar flour-dusted apron. The combat equipment lay neatly folded on a nearby counter, a visual bridge between his two worlds that had finally merged into one. "The state police have secured the prisoners," Cooper reported, his voice respectfully low, "though Dr. Chang says most of them will make a full recovery within hours. Never seen anything like it, disabling that many men without causing lasting injury." He paused, studying the man he thought he'd known. Must have taken years to master that level of precision. Marcus rose slowly, brushing flour from his hands. 15 years in special forces, he spoke clearly, ensuring they could read his lips in the evening light. 5 years learning to bake. Both require the same thing, absolute precision. He turned to face them, his expression thoughtful. The only difference is in the purpose that precision serves. Alisa moved to the first display case, running her hand along the smooth wood. "Marcus, there's something I don't understand," she signed. "The training sessions, the defensive moves you taught us while pretending to just show us baking techniques. You set all this up years ago, didn't you? But why?" Marcus limped to his work table, where a fresh batch of dough was rising. "Because I knew someone would come eventually," he explained, his hands moving in both speech and sign. "The Ghost Warrior's legend was too powerful, too tempting. Someone would want to prove themselves against it, to claim that reputation for their own." His fingers worked the dough with practiced care. "Miguel told me that before he died in the mountains." Cooper picked up one of the tactical gloves, examining its worn surface. "This is from Colonel Miguel Rodriguez," he said softly, recognition dawning. "The hostage who became a hero in his own right after the rescue." He looked at Marcus with new understanding. "The reports said he was fatally wounded, but stayed behind to ensure the others escaped. He was the one who convinced you to find a different path, wasn't he?" The evening light strengthened, bringing clarity to the bakery's warm interior. Outside, they could hear Pine Valley slowly returning to normal. Wagon wheels on packed earth, children's voices carrying from distant homes, life continuing despite the day's drama. "Miguel understood something at the end," Marcus replied, his voice gentle with remembrance. "He said violence creates circles, endless cycles of revenge and retribution. But he also said circles can become spirals, lifting upward instead of spinning in place." His hands, which had demonstrated such lethal precision hours before, now shaped a perfect loaf with equal care. "That's why I chose baking, chose this town, not just to hide, but to create something that could transform violence into nourishment." Sheriff Cooper arrived with a ring of keys at his belt. He watched the scene with newfound understanding, not just a baker preparing his goods, but a warrior showing another way to those caught in cycles of violence. "Got word from the state police chief," he reported. "He'll be here by morning to handle the prisoners, though I reckon some of them might have some thinking to do before then." Steele's voice carried from outside where he sat in a police vehicle, his mobility slowly returning. "What happens now, Ghost?" he called out, loud, enough for Marcus to read his lips through the window. "You've caught us, shown us what real skill looks like. Is this the part where you preach about finding peace?" Marcus's smile held no judgment as he moved to the bakery entrance. "No, Drake, this is the part where you decide what your own legacy will be." He wiped his hands clean, the motion deliberate and precise. "Every man in those cells has a choice to make. The same choice I made 5 years ago in the Hindu Kush Mountains. The ex-Marine with the neck tattoo, now secured but seated more comfortably due to his cooperation, spoke through the open police car window. What choice was that, Baker? Even in custody, his voice carried respect rather than mockery. Whether to let your skills define your future or to find new ways to use them, Marcus replied, moving closer to the vehicles. I chose to transform violence into creation, destruction into nourishment. Through the window, they could see townsfolk going about their evening routines, but something had changed. The fear that had gripped Pine Valley during the Shadow Wolves' occupation had been replaced by something else, not bravado or vengeful pride, but quiet confidence. 5 years, Marcus continued, addressing all the captive riders. 5 years of dawn preparation, learning to use combat skills for protection rather than harm. Every pressure point I targeted today, every nerve cluster I disabled, they all served one purpose: to stop violence without creating more victims. Through the gathering dusk, they could see more state police vehicles approaching, their lights cutting through the mountain mist. Alisa watched from the bakery door as Marcus faced his former adversaries, not with triumph but with understanding. The day's events had revealed her friend's hidden depths, but somehow hadn't changed his essential nature. He was still the man who believed in second chances, who saw the potential for good in every soul who walked through his door. If this tale of transformation has stirred your soul, take a moment to subscribe. The changes unfolding in Pine Valley will show you that redemption can find root in the hardest ground. Dawn painted the bakery windows with golden light as Marcus Chen stood at his workstation, demonstrating the art of bread making to an unusual audience. Through the reinforced glass of the holding cells, several shadow wolves watched intently as his hands moved with precise grace, shaping dough with the same accuracy that had disabled them the day before. The key to perfect bread, Marcus spoke clearly, ensuring his lips could be read clearly through the observation window, isn't in the strength of your hands, but in the precision of your movements. His fingers worked the dough with practiced care, each motion deliberate and controlled. Just like in combat, timing is everything. Drake Steele sat in his cell, the titanium plate in his head catching the morning light. The feeling had fully returned to his limbs, leaving him with nothing but bruised pride and newfound respect. "You're teaching us baking?" he asked incredulously, making sure Marcus could read his lips. "After everything that happened, I'm teaching you control," Marcus replied, his hands never stopping their rhythmic work. "The same principles that make a master warrior can make a master baker. Precision, patience, purpose." He looked up, meeting Steele's gaze. "The only difference is in what you choose to create." The ex-Marine with the neck tattoo, who they'd learned was named James Carter, watched from his cell with particular intensity. "In the Hindu Kush," he said, "when you found me among the hostage takers, you didn't just spare me. You gave me food, treated my wounds." His weathered face showed deep thought. "Been wondering all these years why the Ghost Warrior would show mercy to an enemy." Marcus's hands stilled on the dough as he turned to face Carter fully. "Because Miguel Rodriguez taught me something in his final moments, that every skill, every talent can serve two purposes. Even combat techniques designed for lethal efficiency can be transformed into tools for healing." Alisa Mitchell entered the holding area, carrying fresh coffee and teaching materials. The night had transformed her as well. The schoolteacher, who had learned more than just sign language from her baker friend, now moved with newfound confidence, her movements displaying the subtle defensive awareness Marcus had taught her over years of morning lessons. "The state police chief arrives in an hour," she signed and spoke simultaneously, having taken on the role of interpreter. "He's bringing federal agents. Your identity, your past, it won't stay secret much longer." Marcus smiled as he shaped another loaf. "Maybe it's time," he replied. "The Ghost Warrior's legend served its purpose, drawing out those who glorified violence. Now perhaps it can serve a different purpose, showing that even the deadliest skills can be turned toward life instead of death." Through the holding area windows, they could see Pine Valley awakening to a new day. The bakery's lights were on, a sign that despite everything, the heart of the community still beat strong. Dr. Chang arrived with her medical bag, checking on the prisoners one final time, marveling at the precision of Marcus's pressure point work. "In all my years of medicine," she commented, examining Steele's formerly numbed arm, "I've never seen such precise targeting of nerve clusters. You could have easily caused permanent damage, yet every strike was calculated to temporarily disable, without lasting harm." "The same precision it takes to pinpoint a nerve cluster," Marcus responded, lifting a perfectly formed loaf. "It takes to know exactly when bread is ready to bake. The skills aren't different, only their application." Steele watched the exchange thoughtfully, his usual arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity. "All those morning practices you mentioned," he said, ensuring Marcus could see him clearly. "You weren't just maintaining combat skills, were you? You were learning to repurpose them every morning for 5 years," Marcus confirmed, demonstrating a complex kneading technique that mimicked a combat form. "Before dawn, I would practice transforming each lethal technique into something creative. Every strike became a baking motion. Every pressure point became a way to test dough consistency." Alisa translated for some of the younger riders who couldn't see Marcus's lips clearly. She noticed how they watched his hands with fascination, seeing perhaps for the first time how skill could serve purposes beyond violence. "The federal agents," Cooper interjected from the doorway where he stood guard, "they'll want to know about the Hindu Kush mission, about what really happened in those mountains." Marcus's hands moved steadily, shaping another loaf as he responded. "They'll learn what Miguel Rodriguez understood in his final moments, that the most powerful weapon isn't the one that takes life, but the one that transforms it." He placed the finished loaf in a proofing basket. "That's why he helped me. Plan this, all of it, the bakery, the community, the second chances. Through the morning light, they could see more federal vehicles approaching the town." Pine Valley was about to become the center of attention as the Ghost Warrior's identity became public. But something had already changed in the holding cells. Hardened men watching a baker's hands with new understanding, seeing for the first time how mastery could serve creation instead of destruction. If this tale of redemption has touched your soul, take a moment to subscribe. The lessons unfolding in Pine Valley will show you that the greatest strength lies not in defeating enemies, but in transforming them into allies. 1 month had passed since the day that changed Pine Valley forever. The morning sun found Marcus Chen standing in his bakery, watching a scene that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. Drake steel, the titanium plate in his head catching. The light was carefully kneading dough at the main workstation, his movements showing the same precision that had once made him a feared gang leader. In the corner, James Carter, the ex-Marine turned shadow wolf, now taught younger men the art of bread making. His combat experience transformed into lessons about patience and control. His neck tattoo peaked above his clean white baker's collar as he demonstrated the proper technique for shaping baguettes. "Takes some getting used to, doesn't it?" Sheriff Cooper said, joining Marcus at the window. "Watching men who came to terrorize our town, now helping to rebuild it." He gestured to the street outside, where former shadow wolves worked alongside townspeople, their energy redirected toward community service as part of their rehabilitation. Marcus smiled, his hands moving, in both speech and sign, as Alisa translated nearby. Miguel Rodriguez understood something most miss: that the skills that make a man dangerous can also make him invaluable if turned toward the right purpose. Through the window, they could see Steele teaching a young apprentice how to score bread with the same precision he had once applied to violence. "Had more visitors yesterday," Cooper reported. "Federal agents, military officials, even some foreign operatives, all wanting to understand how you did it. They're calling it the Pine Valley Method." He watched as Carter guided his students through the morning's baking routine, transforming combat veterans and former criminals through precision crafts. "No mystery to it," Marcus replied, moving to adjust one of Steele's techniques with gentle guidance. "Just the truth." Miguel saw in his final moments that every person carries the seeds of both destruction and creation. Our choice lies in which we help grow. Through the morning air came the smell of fresh bread and the sound of laughter. Voices that had once shouted threats now raised in friendly conversation. The bakery had expanded, adding a training program for reformed criminals and combat veterans seeking to redirect their skills toward peaceful purposes. "Got word from the federal prosecutor," Cooper continued. "They're looking at implementing similar rehabilitation programs in other facilities. Seems news of what happened here has reached all the way to Washington." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. "The truth about redemption is that it's never too late to choose it. Miguel taught me that in those mountains." He began his morning routine, demonstrating movements that could be seen as either combat forms or baking techniques, depending on one's perspective. "Come on, it's time for morning practice." In the main bakery area, they found Steele leading the early session. The former gang leader moved with fluid grace, showing how to channel precision and control into creating rather than destroying. The Ghost Warrior's legacy, Steele was saying to his students, wasn't about how many he could defeat. It was about the precision that could transform violence into art. Marcus joined them, his movements flowing smoothly between combat stances and baking techniques. "Miguel Rodriguez's greatest gift wasn't just saving my life in those mountains," he added, ensuring all could read his lips or see Alisa's signs. "It was the understanding that legends don't have to end in violence. They can transform, become something that helps others find better paths." The morning light strengthened, casting long shadows through the bakery windows. Outside, more visitors. Arrived law enforcement officials, military representatives, rehabilitation specialists, all drawn by the story of what was happening in Pine Valley. The tale had spread across the country, a legend not of death, but of transformation. "That's why we start each day here," Marcus continued, his voice carrying to all gathered, "to remember that every morning brings new choices, new chances to turn what we know toward light instead of darkness." His hands moved through a complex sequence that could either disable an opponent or shape a perfect loaf. The real power isn't in how many you can break, but in how many you can help rebuild. Alisa watched from her position near the door, remembering the terrified schoolteacher she'd been just a month ago. Now, she stood straight and confident, helping to teach both sign language and defensive awareness to a new generation of students. "All those years of morning lessons," she signed to Marcus. "You were preparing us for more than just baking, weren't you?" Marcus smiled as he corrected a student's technique. "Every skill can serve life or death," he replied. "The secret is in choosing every day which purpose to serve." He moved through the room, adjusting stances and techniques with the same precision he'd once used in combat. Even the deadliest warrior can become a creator of life. Through the windows came the sound of more vehicles arriving, more visitors, more students, more people seeking to understand the miracle of Pine Valley. But the real miracle wasn't in the transformation of criminals or the redemption of warriors. It was in the daily choice to turn skills honed for destruction toward the purpose of creation. And so the legacy grew, spreading outward from a small mountain town where a deaf baker had shown that even the deadliest skills could serve life rather than death. The Ghost Warrior's legend had transformed, becoming not a tale of violence, but a story of redemption that would inspire generations to come. If this journey of transformation has touched your soul, take a moment to subscribe. The legacy of Pine Valley reminds us that our greatest battles aren't fought with fists or weapons, but with the daily choice to create rather than destroy. 3 months after the transformation of Pine Valley, Marcus Chen stood before a room full of federal agents, military personnel, and rehabilitation specialists in Washington, D.C. The morning light streamed through tall windows, catching the silver in his hair as Alisa translated his words into sign language for other deaf attendees. "The Pine Valley method isn't about turning warriors into bakers," Marcus spoke clearly, his hands moving in precise signs. "It's about understanding that every skill, no matter how lethal its origin, can be transformed into something that serves life." Behind him, video footage showed Drake Steele and James Carter teaching combat veterans the art of artisanal baking, their movements fluid and purposeful. In the audience, General Richards, the man who had originally recruited Marcus for special forces, leaned forward intently. "When we first heard the Ghost Warrior had resurfaced as a deaf baker in a mountain town, many of us thought it was a joke," he admitted, making sure Marcus could read his lips. "But what you've created there, it's revolutionizing how we think about veteran rehabilitation." Marcus smiled as he gestured to the screens showing Pine Valley's transformation. Miguel Rodriguez saw it in his final moments, that the precision required for combat excellence could be redirected toward creation rather than destruction. The footage shifted to show former Shadow Wolves working alongside townspeople, building a new community center. Every pressure point becomes a way to test dough consistency. Every tactical movement becomes a technique for shaping bread. Alisa stepped forward, her confidence now matching her skill as both interpreter and instructor. "The program has expanded beyond just baking," she added. "We're seeing former combat specialists teaching martial arts as meditation, snipers becoming master photographers, demolitions experts turning to sculpture." Through the conference room windows, they could see the Capitol dome gleaming in the morning sun. Inside, more footage showed the daily transformation taking place in Pine Valley. Steele teaching young apprentices the art of patience through bread making. Carter leading meditation sessions disguised as baking classes. But the most remarkable thing, a rehabilitation specialist noted reviewing the data, is the recidivism rate. 0. Not a single participant has returned to violence. How is that possible? Marcus moved to a table where bread-making equipment had been set up. "Let me show you," he offered, rolling up his sleeves. The room fell silent as his hands moved through a series of motions that could have been either combat techniques or baking procedures. Every morning in Pine Valley begins the same way, with a choice, not just to avoid violence, but to transform it into something nourishing. As he demonstrated, the parallels became clear. The precise pressure needed to disable an opponent was the same precision required to know when dough was properly kneaded. The tactical awareness that once kept him alive in combat now helped him sense when bread was perfectly baked. "We're already implementing similar programs in 3 federal prisons," a Justice Department official reported. "Using the skills of former special operators to teach precision crafts to inmates. The early results are promising." From the back of the room, Steele himself stood up. He had been granted special permission to attend, his titanium plate catching the light as he spoke. "3 months ago, I came to Pine Valley looking to destroy a legend," he admitted. "Instead, I found a new way to use the skills that once made me dangerous. The same precision that made me a feared gang leader now helps me create something that brings people together." The screens showed more footage. Pine Valley's expanded bakery program, now officially recognized as a rehabilitation center for veterans and former criminals. Alisa's sign language classes had grown to include tactical awareness training disguised as community defense workshops. "The Ghost Warrior's legacy," Marcus continued, his hands moving in both speech and sign, "isn't in the missions that made him a legend. It's in showing that even the deadliest skills can serve life rather than death." He gestured to where Carter was teaching a group of veterans in real time via video link. "Every day, we choose which path our abilities will serve." General Richards approached the demonstration table, examining the bread-making tools with new understanding. "We spend millions training warriors," he mused, "but almost nothing on helping them transform those skills for civilian life. This could change everything." The meeting continued into the afternoon, with Marcus demonstrating how different combat techniques could be repurposed for creative endeavors. Each movement, each precise gesture, carried the potential for either destruction or creation. The choice lay in its application. "Miguel Rodriguez's final gift," Marcus concluded, his hands moving gracefully through another demonstration, "wasn't just saving my life in those mountains. It was showing me that every skill has 2 edges, one that harms, one that heals. Our daily choice is which edge to sharpen." As the sun began to set over the capital, plans were already in motion to expand the Pine Valley method nationally. The legend of the Ghost Warrior had evolved one final time, transforming from a tale of military precision into a story of redemption that would touch countless lives. If this story of transformation and new beginnings has inspired you, take a moment to subscribe. The legacy of Pine Valley shows us that even the darkest skills can serve the light, if we only choose to redirect their power toward creation rather than destruction. 5 years after the transformation of Pine Valley, Marcus Chen stood in the Hindu Kush Mountains, the crisp mountain air carrying memories of his last mission here. The gravesite before him was simple, a weathered stone marker bearing the name Colonel Miguel Rodriguez and the words, "He taught warriors to become creators." Alisa Mitchell stood beside him, her hands moving in gentle signs as she translated for the group gathered around them. Behind them stood an unlikely assembly. Drake Steele, his titanium plate catching the Afghan sun. James Carter, his Marine Corps tattoo now accompanied by a Baker's certification, and a dozen graduates of the Pine Valley Method program. They had all come to honor the man whose dying words had sparked a revolution in rehabilitation. 10 years ago, Marcus spoke and signed, his voice carrying across the mountain clearing. I carried Miguel from this spot, both of us bleeding, him dying from wounds that would claim his life, me deafened by the explosion that would change mine forever. His hands moved with the same precision that had once dealt in combat, now telling a story of transformation. His last words weren't about the mission, the hostages, or even his own sacrifice. They were about what skills could become when turned toward life instead of death. Steele stepped forward, placing a loaf of perfectly crafted bread at the base of the marker. The same hands that had once threatened Pine Valley had created this offering, each curve and scoring mark demonstrating mastery transformed. The Ghost Warrior's legend brought me to Pine Valley seeking violence, he said, ensuring Marcus could read his lips. Instead, I found a different kind of strength. The mountain wind carried the scent of wild herbs, not unlike those growing in the expanded gardens behind Valley's Rise Bakery. The program that had started in their small mountain town had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Rehabilitation centers across the globe now implemented the Pine Valley method, teaching former combatants and criminals to redirect their skills toward creative pursuits. Alisa, now the program's lead instructor in tactical awareness and sign language, moved to stand beside the marker. Miguel's vision went beyond just saving lives that day. She signed and spoke. He saw how the cycle of violence could be broken, not by burying skills, but by transforming them. Through the clear mountain air, they could see the valley where the hostage rescue had taken place. The compound was long gone, but the impact of what had happened there continued to ripple outward. Carter, who had witnessed the Ghost Warrior's legend born from that very spot, now helped other veterans find their way back to civilian life through the art of bread making. The program has expanded beyond what any of us imagined, Carter reported, his voice carrying pride rather than the hardness it once held. We're opening centers in 20 countries now. Former special operators teaching everything from baking to sculpture, from photography to meditation. Every skill that once served in combat now serves creation. Marcus knelt by the marker, his fingers tracing Miguel's name. He knew, he said softly, that the hardest battle isn't in combat. It's in choosing every day to turn our abilities toward light instead of darkness. He reached into his bag and withdrew a worn envelope, the same one that had sat in his desk that fateful day in Pine Valley. It's time this returned to where it belongs. The letter, Miguel's final message, had never been needed to prove Marcus's identity. Instead, it had served as a reminder of the choice he made here in these mountains. As he tucked it beneath the stone marker, the wind seemed to carry echoes of that day, the explosion, the silence that followed, and the words that had changed everything. The Pine Valley method isn't just about rehabilitation, Alisa translated as Marcus continued. It's about understanding that every skill, every talent carries two possibilities. One that destroys, one that creates. Our strength lies not in which we possess, but in which we choose to nurture. Steele, who now ran his own rehabilitation center in Texas, nodded in understanding. I came to these mountains hunting the Ghost Warrior's legend, he admitted. But standing here, I finally understand. The real legend wasn't in the combat skills that made him feared. It was in the choice to transform those skills into something that gives life. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long, Shadows across Miguel's resting place, the group gathered in a circle. Each person carried bread they had baked themselves, representing their own journey from destruction to creation. The simple ceremony needed no words. The transformation of their lives spoke louder than any speech could. Miguel's legacy, Marcus concluded, his hands moving in both speech and sign, lives on in every person who chooses to redirect their skills toward nurturing life. The Ghost Warrior's legend didn't end in these mountains. It transformed, becoming something that helps others find their way back to peace. As they prepared to leave, Alisa noticed something remarkable. Marcus's movements, always precise, now carried a new kind of fluidity, a perfect blend of the warrior's discipline and the baker's creativity. In him, as in all of them, the two paths had merged into something entirely new. If this tale of coming full circle has touched your soul, take a moment to subscribe. The legacy born in these mountains and nurtured in Pine Valley continues to show us that our greatest strengths lie not in our abilities themselves, but in how we choose to use them. As the sun set behind the Hindu Kush Mountains, casting its final rays across Miguel Rodriguez's grave marker, Marcus Chen and his unlikely family of transformed warriors gathered for one last moment of reflection. The Pine Valley method had grown far beyond their small mountain town, touching thousands of lives across the globe. But here, where it all began, the simple truth of Miguel's wisdom felt more powerful than ever. Drake Steele stood beside his former adversary, his titanium plate catching the dying light. 10 years ago, he said, making sure Marcus could read his lips, if someone had told me I'd find peace through baking bread, I would have laughed in their face. He gestured to the graduates of their program standing around them. Now look at us, warriors turned creators, fighters turned nurturers. Alisa Mitchell, who had grown from a frightened schoolteacher into a confident instructor of both sign language and tactical awareness, translated as Marcus addressed the group one final time. Miguel's last words weren't just about saving my life, he signed and spoke. They were about saving all of us, showing us that our skills don't define us, our choices do. James Carter, the ex-Marine who had witnessed the Ghost Warriors, legend firsthand in these very mountains, added another perfectly crafted loaf to the growing tribute at Miguel's marker. Each loaf, he explained, represents a life transformed, a weapon turned to tool, a warrior who found their way back to peace. The mountain wind carried the scent of wild thyme and rosemary, reminiscent of the herbs now growing in rehabilitation centers worldwide. What had started as one deaf baker's choice to transform his combat skills into something life-giving had blossomed into a movement that was changing how the world viewed rehabilitation and redemption. The Ghost Warrior's legend didn't die in these mountains, Marcus concluded, his hands moving with the precise grace that had once made him legendary for very different reasons. It evolved, becoming something far more powerful, a story about how even the deadliest skills can serve life rather than death. As they prepared to leave this sacred place, each person carried with them not just memories, but a living testament to the power of transformation. The Pine Valley method had proven that true strength lies not in the ability to take life, but in the daily choice to nurture it. Marcus touched Miguel's marker one final time, feeling the roughness of the stone beneath his fingers. In this touch was everything. The explosion that had taken his hearing, the wisdom that had saved his soul, and the legacy that continued to grow with each passing day. If you've been touched by this story of transformation and redemption, if you believe in the power of choosing creation over destruction, take a moment now to join our community. Subscribe to be part of this continuing journey as we explore more tales of hidden strength and unexpected grace. Because every day, somewhere in the world, another warrior is learning to become a creator, another fighter is choosing to nurture, and another soul is discovering that their greatest battles can lead to their most beautiful transformations. This is more than just a story. It's an invitation to believe in the power of change, the strength of redemption, and the truth that our darkest skills can serve the light if we only choose to redirect their power. Subscribe now, and let's continue this journey together. Remember, as Miguel Rodriguez taught us in his final moments, the most powerful weapon isn't the one that takes life, but the one that transforms it. Join us in spreading this message of hope and transformation. Like, share, and subscribe to be part of this growing legacy of positive change. Until next time, from all of us who have found our way from combat to creation, from violence to nurturing, thank you for being part of this journey. Together, we're proving that every skill has two edges, the choice of which to use is ours alone.